Second. All right, Richard. So thanks for coming on the show. Admittedly, we had some tech problems the first time we tried to do this, so I appreciate you rescheduling. And I'm excited to hear your story, video uninterrupted. But why don't you get into your background and how you got into writing, and then we'll talk all about your life memoirs, right? Your story memoirs.
Yes. Well, it is my pleasure, Mitch, and thanks for having me back. This time things seem to be smooth. So, right. How did I get into writing my memoirs? Well, I've always been creative. I've always been a storyteller. I was pretty obsessed with the movies when I was growing up, very much into reading. I was doing a lot of writing my own stories and poetry through high school. So for undergrad, it was sort of a no-brainer to major in English literature and film. I did some film production, and then out of college, I worked in the film industry for a year.
Okay.
Yeah, and worked for Woody Allen on one of his movies. That's sort of my claim to fame there. Curse of the Jade Scorpion, one of his worst movies.
That was the one you worked on?
Yes. Yeah, I was in location.
I don't think I've ever heard of that one.
Dan Aykroyd is in it.
Is it a comedy?
It's a comedy. Charlize Theron is in it.
So but it's a fairly recent movie then.
Helen Hunt is in it. Well, it was 2001, I think.
Well, that's fairly recent. I'm thinking of all Woody stuff when I was in college and high school, and Annie Hall and all that type of stuff. Manhattan.
It's not a black and white one.
No. Yeah. So you were on the set. Did they film that in New York?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if I went up to Woody on the street, would he remember you?
No. No, nor would he even talk to you.
Right. That's true. Get this lunatic away from me. Oh, that's right. Pretty funny. That's pretty funny.
He doesn't talk. You could
have been Steven Spielberg, but you went a different route.
What's that?
You could have been Steven Spielberg, but you went a different route.
I went a different route. Well, there was a writer's strike, is what happened. So I was living in New York, and I had my apartment, and it was $1,500 a month, and all of a sudden there was no work because of the writer's strike. So
and it wasn't like it wasn't like a pandemic and they shut the courts down and you get rent relief, right?
Right. That wasn't happening. So so I got into publishing. I worked for Scholastic for about a year, and then I went for my first master's degree at Temple University, which was in literature with a concentration in creative writing. I worked in marketing at a museum, the Newark Museum, which is a fantastic museum, has an amazing American wing.
Where is it located?
Newark, it's north. It's north side of Newark, near the train station at the north.
Yeah, near Gateway. Yeah. I would think of going to a museum in Newark. I don't know. Yeah. Like I never heard of it.
Near the Newark Bears, the old Newark Bears.
Oh, sure. Yeah, on the river there. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing museum. Really.
Okay, you learn something.
I recommend it. Anyone who's vacationing in Newark.
Never heard of it. Well, if you're vacationing in downtown Newark, you should definitely go to the museum.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So I did that. And then I got into corporate communications for some pharmaceutical companies, Merck and Pfizer. And I did some teaching. I was teaching writing at the college level, Kean University. And then I went for a second master's degree. And it was during that time that my grandfather asked me if I would write his life story. And my grandfather is a World War II vet, was a World War II vet. He passed away a few years ago. He flew fighter planes in the Pacific. And when I grew up, he was telling me stories, and, they always totally fascinated me.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was one story that really stood out. Everyone was telling stories in my family, but my grandfather was a good storyteller. And this story really stood out. So when he asked me if I would write his life story, this is immediately what I thought of, is basically that he, and his fellow soldiers, of the U.S. Army Air Force they'd go out on these missions, and very often the enemy would launch these projectiles up into the air that would explode when they got to the right altitude. So he was flying B-17 fighter planes in the Pacific. And
missiles, basically?
They were, I guess they were missiles. They were these projectiles. They would explode and send out flak, which were these metal shards.
Shrapnel, right? Yeah.
Shrapnel, exactly.
Yeah.
And whatever the flak hit, it destroyed.
Yeah.
So they're flying along hoping that's not going to happen. And sometimes they went out on missions that were supposed to be non-combat missions.
Right.
but
But
then
you
they
don't
became
know.
dummy.
Right. Of course.
Right. So during one battle, the flak, it hit my grandfather's plane and it ripped off the floor of his plane, and pieces went into his leg.
Oof.
And they created these scars that years later I used to marvel at them and run my finger over them. They were like little like worms, kind of on his leg.
Yeah.
They hit him in a couple different areas of his leg.
Yeah.
They also went into his co-pilot's head and they killed his co-pilot.
Ooh.
And as I said, they ripped off the floor of his plane. So my grandfather had to bail out, and some of the other guys in the plane had to bail out. So he parachutes down to save his own life, and he lands in the ocean, and he and other soldiers, they're surrounded by sharks.
Of course.
They're hoping the sharks
Like a
aren't gonna come
movie,
in.
right? You hit the water and the sharks just show up.
Yeah, exactly. In the Pacific,
Right.
I mean, it's loaded with sharks.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've read other stories about where this happened. Sharks surround them, and if there was a lot of blood, the sharks would come in.
Right. Of course. He's injured and there's blood now. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's nuts.
So
right?
these
So they
were missions over Japan, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they had these blow up
Like rafts
life
or something?
preservers.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. The life preservers like
Right.
we have. Right.
Which were also radio devices. So they were called radio flotation devices.
Right.
They named them Mae West.
Yeah. They send out a signal, right? And then they can
Yeah.
find them.
Exactly. But they
Yeah.
called it Mae West, which is funny, because she was this beautiful, curvy actress.
They called what Mae West? The
The radio, the flotation device.
Really? I thought there was
Yeah.
a plane called. Okay. That's crazy.
Well, all the airplanes had different names.
Yeah.
They all named their airplane. So the one airplane, there's a picture of it that I'm going to show you. They called it the sad sack. This was his
There you
airplane, or one of the airplanes.
I got it. And so there weren't too many people on that plane, maybe 4.
Well, he told me that there were 2 different types of planes. One had 2 people in it and one had 5 people in it.
Okay.
I think this is probably a 2-person airplane.
Yeah, right in the middle there. Well, you said there were other people in his plane. Oh no, that might not have been the plane that got the bomb.
Yeah, I don't think that was the plane. I think he was flying a 5-person plane.
Got it.
So
Okay.
they bail out. They're in the ocean. He's got metal in his leg. It's just wild. He's got the flotation device, and finally he gets picked up.
Right. We didn't get eaten because you're writing his memoir. So
yeah, and yeah, I'm thankful for that.
now it's interesting because it wasn't like your grandfather said, I think I want to write my memoir. He had a grandson who was a writer.
Yeah.
And then he said, you know what, my grandson's a writer. Maybe he can write my story. Right. So I don't know if he would have really even thought of that if he didn't have you, right, as being a writer.
Well, I think not. My grandfather had 7 grandsons, and 6 of them are in sales and business of some kind, and one of them, me, is a writer.
Right. There you go. So that's how it happened. Now, were you
Right.
always a writer in high school? You were always on the paper or journalism, all that kind of stuff? Or
I was on the paper just a little bit. I had a film section for a stint, but no, not so much. But I was doing creative writing.
yeah, that's what my daughter did. Now she's a journalism major in Maryland, and I think she actually has a minor in creative writing.
Nice.
So she wants to go to medical school, but she said, well, listen, if I decide not to go to medical school, I want to have something to fall back on. So, she's a good I sent you her story, right? That story that she entered into a contest years ago. Did I email that to you?
Yes, you did. That's right. Yeah.
But it takes a
It was
certain
impressive.
type
Yeah.
of person, you being one of them, right, to write creatively. I mean, it's a skill. And I write contracts, and I've tried to write stories before articles. It's hard. Some people just have a mind for it, to write with, is color the right word, to paint a picture with words. It's definitely not something, everybody should write their book. They say it's not easy, especially if you're telling a story.
It's very, very difficult, and it's even more difficult when you're telling your own story. So I write my own work, and it's fiction, but a lot of it is sort of autobiographical fiction. But yeah, it's much more difficult because you're dealing with your own editor. When I'm writing someone else's story, it's a lot easier and faster.
It is a lot easier.
Yeah, and I have much more objective eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you don't run into writer's block and stuff. They're giving you all the material, right? So
yeah.
It's interesting because I think that a lot of people take it for granted that they could just write a book, and you want to have a quality result, and you need the skills to do it. Now, did you always felt that it came easy to you when it comes to like creative writing, or?
Yeah, At first, I suppose I was sort of driven by my imagination. Like I would come up with, I'd have thoughts, I'd have ideas, and I'd feel this amazing kind of rush
Yeah.
from the ideas, and getting them out into the page, was the labor.
Yeah.
But as you become a better writer, it can become harder.
Harder?
In terms of writing my own stuff, because the editor in you becomes more, say, critical or fine-tuned. But in terms of writing my clients' memoirs, it's become easier. I've become faster. It also helps. It informs the interviewing. The types of questions that I ask and the types of information that I know will make for good reading.
Right. Well, that's
yeah.
It's like I'm interviewing for a podcast, right? I know what's going to make a good podcast and pull it out of you. That's my job, right? Your job is to pull it out of them and to turn it into something that's not only memorable for their family, but interesting and what's the word? Not riveting, but compelling to
engaging,
read, right?
Engaging.
That's the word.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm creative. I can think of all kinds of ideas. Getting it on paper, forget it.
It's a whole nother thing.
Huge disconnect. Yeah.
I mean, it's just abstract when it's in your mind.
Yeah. And then you're trying to think of things and you're writing down, and you're thinking other things, and it's just very difficult. Look, that's why when I'm working on a project or something, I have to write things down and get them down, because if not, they're fleeting. I'm like, what was that? What was I going to do for that? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's hard to keep up because the mind can go a lot faster than you can write it or type it, or, and you don't think necessarily in that order. It's a lot. Writing is juggling. You're juggling a lot of balls. You're filling the reader in on the plot and the character, but you're also
thinking ahead, right? You're trying to weave
you're thinking ahead, but you're also trying to fill the scenery, with things that the reader can actually see and hear and smell, because that's what makes engaging writing is the sensory details.
Right. You don't want to just say, well, he went up in the plane blew up and he jumped and the sharks survived and that's it. You want to see what it's like and feel what it's like to be in the ocean with sharks ready to eat you alive.
Yeah. And you want to know what the cockpit looks like.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking when you said there was other people. I'm thinking, well, what wasn't it like a 2-person plane? Where were these other people sitting, Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. A lot of my clients started writing their own material.
Oh, they did. Like they tried to kind of get it down and they're like, what the?
Yeah.
And you do a lot of interviews. You record a lot of interviews, right? And then you transcribe them so you capture the material.
That's right.
Yeah.
That way I can be really focused when I'm talking with someone. I'm not taking notes. I'm taking little notes, if I have a thought I want to come back to.
Right.
But yeah, I'm recording it. I capture it all. I do the transcription. I make sure it's completely accurate. I have to kind of go back through and make sure that the technology I'm using to do the transcription captures everything accurately, which it doesn't do. So I have to go back through and review it.
Listen to it, right?
Sure. Yeah. And then I work with my clients' words. It's a lot. So, it's a lot of reorganization. It's a lot of editing. It takes time, but as much as possible, it's their words. Sometimes I'm rephrasing
it's from their point of view, right? It's written in their first person,
that's right.
Isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And it says, and it's sort of, it's by them, but I'm doing all the editing. It's a lot of reorganization, removing redundancy. People repeat themselves. People go out of order.
Right.
Sometimes
they're all over the place, right? You got to kind of weave the story. They must be jumping all over the place all the time.
It happens.
Yeah.
But as I've gotten better as an interviewer, I'm better at sort of
keep them on track.
Keeping things in order. Yeah. Keeping them on track.
So this, this is an interesting business, and this is a business podcast, right? So I told you, we talk about that stuff. So here you were, you're helping your grandfather write his memoir. You don't have a business at this point, right? It's not something you do for a living. You were working where were you working at the time?
I was working at Merck.
Doing their copywriting and PR and public.
Well, it's internal communications.
Internal communications, right, to their employees and things like that.
Yeah, I was interviewing employees about the projects that they were working on, their successes, and that way the right hand knows what the left hand's doing, because a lot of people. I was actually in IT. It was, not that I know much about IT, but I was doing the communications for the IT department, which is huge and around, all around the world.
Did you find it interesting, or was it like, it's a job,
Both.
Yeah.
Both. Yeah, it was a corporate atmosphere dealing with a lot of different people, some of whom were very lovely to deal with and some of whom weren't. And, it wasn't fulfilling my soul.
Well, obviously not, right? So,
yeah,
because there's no creativity in what, not that much. in what
It was a little bit of creativity because I'm collecting all these puzzle pieces. I mean, it has some things in common with really any kind of writing or interviewing. I'm collecting the puzzle pieces and then I have to put together the puzzle. That's how it is when I interview my clients. They're giving me all this stuff and you got to put it together the best way so that there seems to be a logical flow to it. And that's what I was doing with the people I was interviewing at Merck and at Pfizer also. They were telling me their stories sometimes, some of it was hard to understand and relate to.
I'm sure this is technology, but you're like an internal reporter, right? So you write in the newsletter and you have to interview them and come up with the articles. So now let's get back to your grandfather. So at the time, you didn't have a business. You'd never done this before, right? You probably weren't. Was there even transcription services besides like stuff you could send out? It certainly wasn't online. Was there online? Probably less, right?
Less, but it wasn't all that long ago. It was probably in 2015.
Oh, okay, fine. So, but what was the whole process? You're like, I don't know how to do this. So did you just start interviewing him, recording stuff, writing stuff down? I mean, now you've done a lot of books, right? So you have a methodology that you use, but so take me through like what happened. How did that happen? I want to hear.
Well,
and you're like, I could do this for a living.
Yeah. Well, with all the aspects of what I was doing, I had to learn the hard way. I was using Dragon software where
That's
I would
the one where you talk, right? You wear the headset and you talk into it, right?
Exactly. So I'm listening and I'm talking.
Right.
And it was a lot of work.
That's hard to do. I've tried that before. It's difficult. It's almost like another language. You have to learn how to talk to the computer so it types for you.
Yeah. At the same time, you're listening and then speaking. So it's like you can hear your own voice while you're listening to something and you're repeating exactly what you're hearing. It's sort of like doing two fairly complicated things at one time. But I don't do that anymore. I've learned a better way to do it.
Yeah.
So I did this for my grandfather. I interviewed him while I was working, and I was also getting my master's degree. I did it.
Must have taken a while with all the things you had going on. You had your job, you were getting your master's degree.
It took a while, and then I was, at once I had it all down on paper. I edited it. I had my document, and then I had to format it into a book. So the technology I was using is not what I use anymore either. It was much older and learned just going through it the hard way. But I, worked with his pictures. I scanned the pictures, I gave them the professional treatment, cropped them, gave them some effects, and laid them out appropriately with the words. And I created a cover, and then I found a printer, and we printed 50 copies, and I gave them out to everyone in the family. And everyone was like, "Wow, cool." And it printed just as my grandfather was passing away. He had a stroke, and everything was finished, and I had just sent the file in, and it was in the process of being printed while my grandfather was in the hospital. I went in there and I told him, we finished it, it's being printed. And he was very happy. He was very pleased. He couldn't talk, but it was an amazing moment that I'll never forget.
Yeah, because if your timing was different, you might not have been able to do it or complete it. I mean, that's the whole key to this, right? Capturing your memoir when you can.
Yes. And it would have been more ideal if I would have been able to put it in his hands, but
right.
It was just a wonderful moment. And then I did my wife's great uncle. I did his book.
Okay. Because he saw your grandfather's and said, "Hey, will you do this for me?"
Yes.
Or
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And also he was in the war too. He fought under Patton, and he had some great stories. I mean, amazing stories.
Patton was in the Pacific too?
No, Patton was in Europe.
Oh, he was. Okay.
Yeah. And so he saw the concentration camps, my wife's great uncle, Hesh.
Yeah.
And some interesting stories. Patton loved war. He was a warmonger.
Yeah.
And they did something where I guess it was after the war, or it was either near the end of the war. They were coming through some village in Germany, and some citizen took a little shot at one of the tanks, and it dinged off the tank. So he said, Patton, they brought the tanks back to the top of the hill and they leveled the town.
Because of that one guy who shot at the tank?
Yeah. And then after that, whatever town they'd come through, the Burgermeister, which is the mayor, would come out and meet the army and say, hey, don't worry.
Right. Don't flatten our town. Right.
Don't flatten our town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it worked.
Yeah, it worked.
They weren't going to shoot again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Patton loved war. So yeah, that was really interesting. So I did that. And then I started presenting and talking about what I was doing at assisted living homes and, residences like that. And I was able to start putting together some fantastic projects
It was
And then
still a side gig though at this point, right? I mean, you still kept your job. You weren't like,
it was around that time that
you're
I
just like,
left my job.
pack it in.
I'm packing it in. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So did you like you're a writer, so you probably didn't do this, right? Well, your brothers would do this. Did you sit down and put together a plan and say, well, okay, if I'm going to do this, how many do I need to do? You knew roughly, well, I don't know if your grandfather, the first one was probably a bad example of how long it would ultimately take, right? Because you've gotten better at it. But did you sit down and say, okay, this is how many I need to do, so this is what I can charge? I guess you really didn't know like what people would pay for it, right? So that's something you learned also. How did you do that kind of strategic, like, how do I move to this stage of my life type of planning? I'm always curious.
Yeah.
Now, some people are just like, I just winged it and I'm lucky I'm here. But I don't know.
I guess I'm probably a little bit like that. I mean, and I'm trying to remember now. I did write out some kind of plan, but I didn't think it was like a very good business plan. I mean, I'm not really a businessman. I did have I have another business where my wife and I were tutors, but she tutors math. She's a math teacher. I'm not.
Yeah, my wife tutors math too.
Oh yeah, yeah. And
it's hard to make a living. I mean, there's so many kids you can see at one time, and your eyeballs are hanging out of your head at night. She's tutoring like 3 to 10 at night. I'm sliding food under the door because these kids all need help. Especially with the pandemic, it's gotten difficult. And I mean, what, she get $80 an hour? Take five hours for her to make what I make in an hour. So, but it's difficult. But yeah, so if you have that cash flow, I guess that helps. But I mean, at some point, you had to say, well, can I make a living doing this, right?
Yeah. And my pricing was all different. I had to figure out what my pricing was. And as I got better at it and I became more confident in my work and, had more to show for it, my pricing went up. And, my pricing is at a pretty good place now where I feel that, it's amazing value. You're not going to find better value for someone to write your memoir than what I offer, because if you look up what ghostwriters are charging, it's a lot. But I came up, I have my own methodology and I can move at a pace. And I feel really good about where I am. So I've just grown, and I'm still growing, and you have to kind of go through the fire to do it. So I had kind of a basic plan that I, wouldn't think that any business person would be impressed by. But
no, I'm not saying that. I was just curious, the whole thought process, right? Because
I committed.
You're selling your time, really, is what you're doing, right?
I mean, I put a lot of thought into it before I stopped working for Merck and, realized that I wasn't very happy doing it, and realized that I had to come up with some plan I was going to commit to, that would be fulfilling and make use of my talents, in a way that could support my family. And so I jumped in, I committed to it. And that's really the key, I think, because a lot of, I think you can't stand
in the doorway. You have 2 feet on either side. It's just,
that's right. I was going to do it no matter what. And worst came to worst, I'd get another job like I had at Merck.
Right, because you weren't happy at Merck, so you were going to leave there regardless. You just kind of got lucky and fell into this, because this was not were there other people doing this at the time, like writing people's memoirs?
Not really. A lot of the people I talked to
for the president, right? But
a lot of people I talked to, they say they've never heard of someone who's doing what I'm doing. Yeah, because it's not really for commercial. I mean, I do books that are for commercial purposes. Mostly, I have a couple nonfiction book proposals I'm working on, which is what you do for commercial nonfiction books. You do a proposal which has some sample chapters in it. So I'm doing that also. But but the life story memoirs, they're for the family, it's for the legacy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to. Most people don't publish it. Right. Put it out. I mean, not public. Well, publishing is they printed it, but commercially, right.
I mean, some people they want to put it on Amazon, and they can. Self-publishing is a whole thing. It's different than it used to be. Self-publishing is a major industry, and people can put it on Amazon.
Yeah, right. If you tell all your friends, they buy enough, you'd be like a bestseller for a day.
Yeah, exactly. 100 books advance sales, and you're a bestseller.
Right. Is that what it is?
Within reason, I think so.
It's 100, some sort of a number, then you're a bestseller, and you could say, my memoir was bestseller. Yeah, best-selling book.
Yeah. But I always say, your memoir is a bestseller within your family. Everyone buys it.
Right, of course. Now, this is true ghostwriting, right? It doesn't say it might say who provided the book, but it's not by you.
No, it's by them. It's by the client. On the back of the book, I say with me.
Right, and as to how you want a little bit of promotion, right? It says how somebody says, how'd you do this? Oh, well, look at the back.
I have my logo on there and my contact information. Yeah, but it's not quite ghostwriting. Because ghostwriting is where you're kind of like, it's a little more commercial style. The whole tone of a commercially written book when you read it, it's a little bit different than these life story memoirs, because it's a different kind of editing, and sort of the writing is from scratch. So it's like, a presidential book, you're going to interview the guy for, a long time. You're going to take a lot of notes, and you're going to kind of write it from scratch, create the prose from scratch. Right. But mine is a happy balance between, using my client's words as much as possible and editing it as much as needed to make it into an engaging read, so that when you read it, it reads nicely, but it's the client's essence. It's so the relatives, the family who are reading it, they're like, oh yeah, that's grandma's voice. Like, that's totally grandma. Those are the stories she always told.
Oh, really? Plus, I'm sure that makes you feel good though when you hear that.
Oh yeah.
Like you got it right.
I got it. Yeah. 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 That's the name of the game. And each is its own piece of art, and each person has their own personality, their own unique flavor and style and essence. And I really get to know them when we talk, we become buddies. I mean, that's my favorite part.
You spend how many, 20 hours or so with them, or I don't know.
Usually not 20 hours. I mean, I have one client, I interviewed him for 24 hours, but the average is more like 8 hours.
Okay. Still, you and I spent 8 hours together. We know each other pretty well.
Yeah.
Especially if you're good at it. I mean, you have a skill.
Yeah.
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 So now is the way you write the book, is there a certain structure to the book that you kind of follow? Like when I do a podcast, for example, and the reason I did this is there's a commercial reason, there's a business reason for doing this, right? I have a structure for at least the audio portion, the way I structure in commercials and things like that. And I follow the same formula every time, because it's a labor intensive to try and make it up every single time and figure it out. So I know where everything goes, and I throw them in and slide them over and fade them in and out. Boom, I'm done. 40 minutes, including all the publicity, I'm finished. Is that the same kind of a process? Like you have a skeletal structure that you're using and you're plugging everything in, or is it harder to do that because you don't know really what their story is going to look like?
I would say there's sort of a high level organization, which is chronological for the most part. And within that, it's a little more, kind of go with the flow. Like I definitely follow breadcrumbs, but then I bring it back. So people will go off on tangents, and that's fine. And that's good, because that's where a lot of the good material is generated. I mean, you want stories, things connect in strange ways. I mean, someone might be talking about getting into their career, and then suddenly they go into something related to their career that's 30 years later, where they're talking about their family and somehow their career comes up. And when I'm editing, probably the hardest part of it is figuring out the right order of information, right? Because things connect in all these.
Yeah, because that's the way our mind works. So we can't read things like the way our mind works. It's too confusing.
Right.
Yeah.
But my process has made it easier. So I basically, I get to know the client a little bit before we begin, because I do sort of the consultation, and I have to collect enough information to be able to put together the proposal and estimate how many hours I'm going to be interviewing them for, and therefore what the cost was going to be.
You give them a flat fee based on what your research, or is it an hourly type of thing?
Well, it's based on the amount of interview hours
that you think you're going to do.
Yeah, and I estimate how many hours I think are required. So based on an initial conversation, I get an idea of the scope of the story, and the scopes are always different. Not everyone. Some people are talking about their entire lives. They're talking about their childhood, their earliest memories, coming all the way up to the present. And some even go further back than that, because we get into genealogy, talk about whatever they know about their family before they were alive. And I also have some genealogists that I work with, where if they want, we'll get more stuff. I have a client where we found out all this interesting information about their family going back to like the 1600s. Got addresses, birth certificates.
So it becomes a little bit of history of the family plus his memoir.
Exactly. And occupations, where they lived, addresses, all of that, how they moved. This guy who I'm talking about, he grew up in Prague. He's a Holocaust survivor from Prague, and his mother's family came from out in the countryside, like on the east of Czechoslovakia, where they had been Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they very much identify that, they spoke German, they identify with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And, people who grew up in empires have a lot of pride, related to that. Whereas his dad's family, we grew up in the city, came from the city. So growing up in so in his home, they were bilingual. They spoke German and Czech, which is interesting. Really interesting. And we were able to incorporate all the manifests. His dad had, before World War II, was a businessman. He made trips over to the US and England, and we had marriage certificates, death certificates, all of that, addresses. But other people, they don't want to talk about, such a wide scope. Like I have one book I did for a couple who they spent 15 years in the Foreign Service.
Okay.
The man worked in the Foreign Service for 15 years. They lived in 5 different amazing locations around the world during that time. One of the locations, they were in Tripoli, Libya in 1969 during the coup when Gaddafi took over.
Wow.
And they saw it. They were driving out on a highway. They were going out to the desert to have a picnic that day in their VW van. And a whole military caravan passed them on the way into the city.
Didn't even stop them. They didn't care.
No, they were coming in
Right.
to the city. And they were like, that's weird.
Yeah.
So they decided to turn around and cancel the picnic and come back to the city. In the middle of the night, they hear gunshots. The next morning, it's a whole new regime. They're changing the street signs from English to, I guess, Arabic.
Yeah.
And there's soldiers on every corner. And it was frightening.
I'm sure.
But it was 1969. So it kind of fed into like the revolutionary spirit of the time. So there were some people, even American colleagues of my clients who he worked with, who were kind of excited about it. And then they were kind of young, they were in their 30s. Yeah. Interesting to capture that feeling.
Yeah.
So the scope can really vary. And I'm very good now at estimating how many hours are needed to create the book that my client has in mind, envisions. But we can add on and we can subtract depending on my client's budget.
Right. And you have that discussion with the client. You explore that.
Exactly. And when I put the proposal together, I come in with an outline and it's a loose, high level outline of how much time we're going to spend on each topic. And it generally goes in chronological order, childhood, adolescence.
Right. Well, because
career,
then the person
love,
reading
family.
the book can kind of digest it.
Yeah.
Without getting too confused.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it might be organized a different way. In the end, I might organize it thematically, but I kind of have to have those puzzle pieces to really know how I'm going to put the puzzle together.
Right. So chronologically, you have it laid out, but it might ultimately end up different.
Yeah.
Depending on what looks good. Now, is there audio and visual video components to this? Like, does somebody get an accompanying, if they want, do they get accompanying video or an audio book? I don't know who would do the audio book. You got to get the person to do the audio book before they pass away or something.
So I offer some additional services, including a DVD. So for one client, I've done it for a couple clients.
Would it be like a movie, you interviewing them, or would it be like a slideshow with the book?
Well, I have a videographer come and video the interviews. Usually not all of the interviews, usually 1 or 2 sessions. And then they edit it. It's the interviews. We include old photos. We include old home movies if they have it. And in fact, the guy from Prague, his father used to take movies, 16 millimeter movies back in the 1930s, which we incorporated.
Wow. That's spectacular.
So my client, he's 90 years old. We got these movies of him as a 4-year-old.
They're reels?
Yeah, they're real, but they were digitized.
Oh, he had them digitized already. Okay.
You got to get them digitized.
Yeah, or else they'll just.
In fact, I got them digitized. I'm remembering now. They were reels. They were big reels like this. Yeah. Right. So I took them. I brought them to the store. I got them digitized, and then my videographer incorporated, some of it where it made sense, and we can put in music, and it's a fantastic, amazing thing. We also included animation. So my client, he envisioned. In Indiana Jones, when Indiana Jones travels from one part of the world to the other, it shows the airplane going across the map, the line.
Right.
So we did that. Yeah.
So you did that, like when it was going from one place to another?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have that in the movie. It's great. And these days, I mean, these videographers, they have all types of animation that you can do. You can take a still photo and make it look 3D with shadows behind it. Things like that. So yeah, I offer that as a supplement to the book.
Right.
I also the audio interviews, I can edit those and create them, make them into chapters, but like segments, like 5 to 12 minute segments, and then I can provide that. Yeah.
Right. It's like you're making them a podcast of the book.
Yeah.
And podcast stands for play on demand, right? So you're taking the clips and you're making kind of a show out of it.
Yeah, and it's it's amazing, you know, in addition to having the book, you can listen to your loved one's voice after they're gone.
Right. Well,
You know,
that's,
it's a beautiful
there's
thing.
a lot of value.
Yeah,
I get people that they die, they don't want to give me the original will from their husband or wife because they're like, it's the only copy I have. I'm like, yeah, but you have to file the original with the surrogate's office in the county. You can keep a copy, but you're not getting back the original. That goes on file in the surrogate. So if that was the purpose of the will, and they're like, holding on to it, they don't want to give it to me.
it would be nicer if they had, say, a book or, you know, the story or
Yeah, correct.
the voice. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe when, I'm doing their wills, I should give them your card and say, hey, did you ever think about this to preserve
Yeah.
your legacy?
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I could remember everything that's happened in my life, what I would say. I mean, I don't know. During our lifetime, it wasn't like we went to war. Like we just didn't grow up with that. It was a different time. But I guess if you sit and talk long enough, you start to think of things, right?
Yeah. Not everyone's story would make like a blockbuster film.
Right.
Some people's stories would, and I've worked with a lot of Holocaust survivors. Very, interesting. But I have clients whose lives are more, say normal, but they're unique.
Yeah.
And they're beautiful. I mean, just the story of like falling in love, and or becoming a parent, is unique to each person. Just the way that it happened, the way that it, what it meant to them.
Yeah.
But one of the things I love is that when I'm interviewing someone, they know a lot of the things they're going to say in advance, and it's a lot of the stories they always tell. But I ask a lot of questions, I make a lot of connections, and they always think of things they haven't thought about in years. Right. They are experiencing memories that they have.
Well, that's what happens with your mind, right? Once you get going.
Yes. You get in a role,
popping out.
Yeah. And that has a lot in common actually with just creative writing. It is like, it's the act of creation is happening in the moment.
Yeah. Well, that's your job, right? I mean, your job is to get them flowing, so to speak.
Yes.
It's not a computer where you just put in a search term and you get something out. So the skill is getting it out of your head.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you look at books like Harry Potter, the Harry Potter series, right? Very detailed, very colorful. But, we could all think of things like that, like magical worlds and stuff, but to get it down on paper, to make it all fit together, right? It obviously takes a certain kind of person or a certain kind of skill to do it because.
Right. But I guarantee you, she didn't have it all figured out before she sat down to write.
I'm sure
it invented itself
process, right?
Through the writing. She had something in her mind, a place to start, but it invents itself while you're writing because you gain momentum. You're like a snowball rolling downhill.
Right. Well, I guess you're always going back and forth to make sure things fit, right?
Oh yeah. But not so much.
You ever have stories that like something doesn't make sense? It's not consistent. You got to ask them, "Are you sure about that? This doesn't match up with this," and people get confused.
Yeah, that happens. Yes, and a lot of my clients are elderly and they have cognitive, impairment, which is normal. Just getting older, and I have clients also who have dementia. And
they're hard to interview.
They can be.
Yeah.
I mean, it can can get to the point where
lucid moments, right, where they can.
Well, there's so many different levels of it. Normally, if I'm interviewing someone who has dementia, they're in the early stages, and we're trying to do it.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, but it's common to think one thing and something else comes out of your mouth, or to be confused about the chronology of events, or not remember when something took place, or have to get back to me on it. Very often when I'm working on someone's book, I have a document of questions that I'm coming up with, so I can come back to them later on and ask them some questions and fill in the blanks.
You interview other family members, especially if the person has early onset dementia.
Yeah,
you do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different scenarios that I've had. I had one. Sometimes the family members just want to participate. So I interviewed this amazing doctor who had been, for his service, he was a doctor at Leavenworth Penitentiary back in the 50s. Wow. And he befriended Machine Gun Kelly.
Oh, okay. That's a cool story.
Yeah. He said he was a nice guy.
Yeah. Except for all the shooting and the murdering.
Yeah. Actually, he didn't murder anyone. Like it's amazing.
No, he wasn't the guy.
This whole kind of legend built up around him. The media made a huge deal of him, and they were made movies of him, but it wasn't all accurate. And James Taylor actually has a song called Machine Gun Kelly, which corroborates the story that my client told me, is that Machine Gun Kelly was kind of a simple guy, and it was his wife who was the ambitious one.
Okay.
But so this guy's really interesting, and he wanted me to interview his children after. So his 3 children. So I interviewed them, and they're like tributes to their father, which I put on as an appendix.
Okay.
But I have another book that I did where everyone wanted to participate. I interviewed 24 people.
Wow.
Yeah.
All from the same family, different
generations. Yeah. And it was just great because a lot of people told the same stories, but they all told them their own way.
But it was still a book about one person, right? It was
all about one person. Yes.
The grandfather, whatever, the patriarch.
Yeah, exactly. And this guy's the patriarch, and boy, was he a patriarch. He was he was buddies with Frank Sinatra. I mean, this was a big head honcho guy.
Yeah.
You know, super successful guy who had 350 shoe stores. And it was great. And I loved how, you know, these stories become legend in a family. They become lore. You know, so people are telling the same stories, but they're telling them from their own points of view.
Yeah, and they change a little bit when you write it down. It kind of locks it in, right?
Exactly. But you get different details from different people, and it starts to really fill it out and make it like more 3-dimensional. And then that had a big effect on how the book was organized. You know, because so for like, you know, the doctor's book where the children, it was just organized by, you know, the first child, the second child, the third child. But with this other guy's book, it was organized by story.
Okay.
You know, and it was set up almost like a play with dialogue. You know, this person says this, you know, and it becomes like a conversation.
Got it. Yeah. Well, that's the art of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
You can do it different ways. Ever discover, and I see from behind you, you've interviewed men, you've interviewed women.
Yep.
Ever, you know, interview somebody and they're like, listen, I've never told anybody this, but I did this bad thing. And maybe, you know, it's so long ago that it's not criminal anymore, but you ever discover things like that? You're like, you know, like Meyer Lansky. I just saw that movie called Lansky, and it was about him being older and then meeting with his journalist. The journalist is writing his story, right? Which I guess is true. He must have wrote the story. And it went back and forth in terms of time telling his story. But he's like, listen, you can't publish this until after I die. He did die like right after the book was ready. But yeah, you ever get any of those that you can remember?
Yeah.
If they wouldn't have to kill you if you revealed it?
I mean, you know, a couple of things. I have one client whose father he wasn't in the mafia, but he was involved with the mafia. He had a time where he was selling some drugs, you know, that had belonged to the mafia, and he got caught, and they were, you know, he became part of this, you know, very large case against this, you know, this Don. Right. And he had to go in there and he had to figure out a way
or something.
He had to testify. And I have the transcript that his son provided me. And it's really interesting and revealing about this guy's, you know, my client's father's personality. He was a smart guy, and he was wise. He was like a wise guy a little bit. Right. And he had to figure out a way to, you know, answer the questions so that he would stay out of jail, yet not incriminate the mafioso, you know, and be in trouble with him.
Yeah, and so you don't end up dead.
Yeah. So he was able to do that. I just recently I finished this memoir. This is Estelle. She is, you know, just an amazing lady, amazing family woman, and became very successful with her husband. They started their own jewelry business. But she told me this story that she'd never told anyone, where when she was young, she was growing up in Brooklyn during the Depression. She had heard that cats always land on their feet. Yeah, so she grabbed her grandparents' cat,
threw it out the window.
They lived on the second floor. She threw it out the window, and she didn't even watch. Like, she was standing back. She couldn't see if the cat landed or not. And then she started to feel a little bit bad about it. And then the cat was at the door downstairs.
Right, because it did land on its feet.
Yeah.
Well, it's good she didn't live on the 9th floor, because landing on its feet might have still killed the cat.
Yeah, even if it lived, it might not have made it back to the door.
So is that in the book?
Yeah, that's in the book. And I don't think she told anyone that, but she, you know, she talked about, she was very confident, and she was maybe a little bit mean, but she became a very nice person. And she, you know, it was kind of like very, you know, she was really outgoing, and it was kind of central to like who she is and her personality. And, you know, it was really fit.
Yeah. My grandma was like that. She was the meanest woman you ever met until she got older. She was just tired, I guess. She didn't, but my wife's like, oh, grandma was so sweet. And my dad would be like, well, you didn't know her when she was young in her prime.
Right.
You know, I don't know where that all comes from.
I hear that a lot. Yeah.
That old Jewish, you know, anger.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. But, you know, people also tell me things and then they say, don't put that in the book, or they tell me things that come out in a you know, a very kind of dark, rough way, and I'm able to edit it so it's you know, so that it's said diplomatically.
Right. So it doesn't offend people or give them a bad impression of the person,
Yeah.
or,
Right.
you know, like, you know,
Right.
maybe you don't tell them they put an ice pick in his back of his head. They just had a disagreement.
It was, yeah.
They don't know what happened there.
Right.
Yeah,
But yeah,
exactly.
people, yeah, yeah, you know, family secrets come out.
Yeah. So any interesting, you know, people that you've interviewed in terms of, like, let's put the veterans aside, because there's probably a lot of those, right? Holocaust survivors, is probably a lot of those, and they're probably running out because I don't think there's a lot that are still alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Says
Yeah.
years go
I mean,
on.
the ones that I meet now, they were very young during the Holocaust. I was just speaking to a Holocaust survivor yesterday. She's 81. So she was in hiding from 2.5 to 5. She was from Holland. She was with
Yeah, that's where
16
Anne
different
Frank
families.
was, right?
Yeah.
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 So Holland, they're hiding. So
Yeah.
so 2.5 so 2.5 half of her life when she was
Yeah.
little was
Yeah.
hiding.
Yeah. And so most of her story really is what, you know, the aftermath.
Yeah.
She was with 16 different families, and when she finally reunited with her family, she kind of expected at any minute to be moving on to the next family.
Right. Because that's what happened. She had been conditioned.
Yeah, exactly. And she was very, you know, adaptable to whoever she was with, but they weren't parenting her. They were just taking care of her. So now she's back with her parents, and they're trying to parent her and teach her things and tell her to do things. And she's like, who are you? Why are you telling me this stuff? I don't need to listen to you.
Right.
So her whole life, she never really had a good connection with her family.
Yeah.
And that's because of the Holocaust.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend who's 90, I think Peter's like 95. And his wife too. They're both Holocaust survivors, and he's getting up there.
Peter Fleischman.
Yeah, you know Peter?
Yeah.
Have you written his book?
No, but I spoke to him. Actually, you know, talking about getting started in my business, I met with him because he was volunteering for SCORE.
Yeah, he's still, I speak for SCORE because of him. I'm speaking in February. He's always like, Mitch, will you do a business thing for us for SCORE? I'm like, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's how I know him, and he saw my business plan, and that was, you know, early in the story of LifeStory, and then I heard him speak about his experiences over a Zoom meeting one time for a synagogue.
Yeah, he speaks a lot about Holocaust, his survivals and stuff.
Yeah.
Never wrote his book, huh? Might want to capture.
No,
that
I
when
would
we
I would
can.
love to write his book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, tell him.
Okay. No, go
Remind
ahead. I will. I got to see him next week or so. So I'll remind him about it. Okay, so let's talk about how people can learn about what you do. Obviously, they don't go to your website and download one of the books because they're private books, you know, right? But there must be stuff on your website and stuff as to what the service is and things like that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have some excerpts on my website, so you can see examples. You know, I put up a few pages.
And you know, it's yourlifestory.com?
No, it's LifeStory Memoir.
LifeStory Memoir. Okay.
Yeah,
Put
so
that
you can
in the show
visit
notes.
LifeStoryMemoir.com. You can reach me, Richard@LifeStoryMemoir.com.
Okay.
Email me anytime.
Okay.
And on my website, there's a lot of information. It talks about the process, talks about different kinds of books that I do, because in addition to the life story, you know, sort of comprehensive memoirs, I also do these shorter tributes. I do these like celebration books. So here's an example. This is a tribute to a woman who passed away. This was actually my Spanish teacher, Senora Fredman.
Okay.
And it's shorter, and it's more design heavy. It has more pictures, and it's more like vignettes, and it's a lower price point because I don't interview the person for as long. But you know, it's a tribute, and I can include things that people sent in. So some of what's in there are, you know, tributes that people said after she passed, you know, and cards sent in.
Oh, that's nice.
And memories, you know, and I interviewed a few people to get short anecdotes. So that's another offering. And I do things like that around weddings. I love doing a love story.
Yeah, that's nice. It's a nice keepsake. Now, what made you think of that idea?
What made me think of it? I don't know. It was just, I guess I wanted to come up with something that was a lower price point and that I could do more quickly. And the idea of doing that, and through networking, I met some, you know, people who run funeral homes. And so the idea of getting involved with funeral homes seemed like a good idea.
Yeah, and then the tribute makes sense, right? Because they probably have passed away, and it's nice things. It's better than just the address book you get where people signed in that they were there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, it's warm and it's sort of customized to the person,
Nice.
and I love that idea.
Yeah.
Those are tough times, but it makes people, I have a friend who just passed away. So I'm terribly, and he was very much into rock and roll. So I'm doing a rock and roll style tribute.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's neat. Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. I think the whole thing is a neat concept. You just, it not only it's your work and your, writing and stuff, but you're doing really nice things for people. It's perpetuating, because that's always a problem, right? Your grandfather passed away, your great grandfather. I don't have that stuff from my grandparents. I have some stories I remember talking to them. My dad remembers stuff, but he forgets over time, and it just gets lost. Those are stories that are passed down by word of mouth.
That's right. They get watered down. They get,
you don't remember.
Yeah, they get dull. They're sharp at first, then they dull out and they pass on from generation to generation. They just get duller. Yeah, I mean, what I do is just so fulfilling. I love it because it's so, it goes to the heart. It really goes to the heart of things, and it's really meaningful to people. And it's not like, just dealing with numbers.
Yeah, your tagline should be preserving the history of mankind one person at a time.
Oh,
that could be your tagline, right? So that's kind of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also amazing how everything fits into a larger historical context.
That's true, right? And the time in which they lived and the things that were going on. And,
yeah. Some are like super historical, like Holocaust and war stories, right. But things in the world are going on, and they have a huge influence on how you view the world and the choices that you make.
For sure. Yeah, it must be interesting to take a step back from that when it's done and look at your life and see, I don't know, probably cathartic, I would think.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've had very few unhappy customers. Most people are probably pretty thrilled with the process, right?
I have 100% satisfaction rate.
That's a good rate.
It's a good rate. Yeah. I mean, that's the most important thing to me is, and I'll go above and beyond. And, when I interview someone, when we agree on 6 hours, it always goes a little bit beyond that.
Course,
and,
right.
And we'll go back and forth. There's a whole review period where they get to make sure everything seems right. And sometimes, we have to make some edits.
But you want it to be good, both for your own personal reason and for them to be happy. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it represents them,
exactly.
And it's, and the whole thing is that it's their story in their words, from their point of view.
Right. Well, I think it's awesome. So it's LifeStoryMemoir.com.
Yes.
Richard Squire. Is it Richard Squires? Is that your last name with an S? That's what I thought. Okay. Yeah. I thank you for joining me 2 times. We had no technical problems today, which is nice.
Amazing.
And let's definitely stay in touch and see who we can get their life story written over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just throw out that if anyone's listening to this podcast and they want to reach out to me and become a client, I can offer a discount.
Okay.
I'm happy to do it.
Okay. Sounds good. I appreciate it. Thanks, Richard.
My pleasure. Thank you.